Hey Francis, Luke Lundahl here with Lundahl Performance. I want to thank you for the video you submitted, and I just want to do a brief introduction to kind of set up the points that I wanted to make in the actual voiceover video. So if I'm really looking, if I'm looking to nitpick as far as him loping around and what you're doing with him there, because you obviously have worked a lot with this horse and you've gotten a lot done. But in me personally, if I was going to nitpick, as far as him, at the canter, softening him up, taking hold of his face, that sort of thing, I'd like to see a little bit more black and white between when you pick up and when you release. There's a ton of different theories out there of how the horse should feel in the person's hand and, how the horse should respond when you take a hold of his face. So that's kind of personal preference because there's, a million different ideas out there. And me personally, I like to have one that feels really soft and light in my hands, and I would like to see, when you pick up on his face, that you wait a little bit longer until he really commits to softening there at the withers, like have that neck go down. He kind of softens a little bit in the face, but his neck really doesn't move. So there I take a hold of him, and you got to use your legs to drive basically his rib cage up over the bridle is kind of what you're thinking about mentally as you do it. You want to use your legs to drive that neck down. And then when you do release him and pitch him away, give him a little bit more rein and dare him to see what happens on a completely loose rein. You're kind of in a little bit of a gray area where when you do release, there's still a little bit of contact there. He's still kind of released. So clear that up a little bit and make it very obvious from when you do pick him up to when you do pitch him away and release. And as far as the turnaround, if I was going to nitpick there or give you some tips on maybe where to move on now, because he obviously knows how to turn and you've worked on that a lot. So now I can see is maybe you're in a stage where you could step it up, and I would work a lot more on the start of your turn. In the video, a lot of the time you're kind of pulling him into the turns all the time, and so we never really do get to see him at a standstill and how he starts that spin. And so I would work a lot on teaching him to start that spin on a loose rein rather than having you take a hold of him and pull him into the turn. And the same thing when he is actually in the turn. Don't hold on to his face so much all the time and kind of hold him in that turn. Pitch him away on a loose rein and see what you've got. It may fall apart, and that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. That really just gives you an excuse to get that maneuver better. Because you want to dare him and just see if he really mentally engaged with you and does he want to stay in that turn by himself. As far as, perfecting maybe his body position and the way he turns, I would say, for me personally, I would work a little bit more now on getting that rib cage lined up with his body. You'll be able to see on the video when his hindquarters is to the camera and his head is away, you can almost look and see his rib cage kind of hanging to the outside of that spin. And if you can get him straightened up in that rib cage, I still want him looking in for sure, but I'd like his body a little bit straighter and put him in a more balanced position, and that will help him kind of load up on his hind end and step a little bit more free. And you'll notice as well that he does a bit of swapping ends as he goes into that spin, and a lot of that can be because, one, his rib cage is to the outside, and so all that weight is transferred to the outside of that spin, and so it kind of almost pulls his hip around as he moves his shoulder. And two, he's a bit sluggish with moving that shoulder off your leg, and a horse that is sluggish and really doesn't want to move his shoulder, they kind of get lazy and they start to do that swap ends or Coke bottle, whatever you want to call it. So I would do two things in that situation. I'd work a lot on getting his rib cage straightened up, get his body straightened up in that spin, and I would work on getting that shoulder moving. When I lay that neck rein and draw it a little bit more, that shoulder moves, that he doesn't get sluggish, and if I use my leg and tap him there, that shoulder moves. Get that shoulder freed up, and that will load him up naturally on his hind end a little bit more, and he'll keep the hind end more stable and still while that front end moves around. Alrighty, here we go. So we'll start off here at the lope, and you can kind of see what I was talking about as far as, when pitching him away. I'd like to see a little bit more drape in that rein, so when you do turn him loose, you can double check that he knows he's responsible for maintaining his direction and frame and speed. Now there you changed leads and you wanted to pick up on him, but you notice how he is still a bit up in the neck. So I would wait there when you do soften him up, make it very black and white from when he's released to when you're softening him up. But when you do soften him up, stay in there a little bit longer, use your legs to drive that rib cage up and wait for that neck to break at the withers and soften down. Now here in the turnaround, you'll see, I think it's this time, really pay attention to when his hip is to the camera and his neck is away, right there. Well, look at that hip. See how it's kind of hanging to the outside of your spin? If you can get that straightened up in that spin, and I would do that a lot at the walk outside of the spin, walk forward and around, get that rib cage off your outside leg. If you can do that, it'll put his body in a more balanced position, and it will allow him to turn a lot freer. Secondly, you can notice he kind of moves his hip quite a bit. As he's turning around, he swaps ends or Coke bottles, whatever you want to call it. And so I would say two things are going to fix that. One, straightening that rib cage up in the turn. But two, make sure when you draw that rein or tap him with that outside leg behind the girth, make sure that shoulder will move. It looks a bit sluggish to me, and if you can work on getting him to hustle that shoulder when you ask and getting him a little bit more freed up in that spin and getting that rib cage straight is going to help that. But if you can get a little bit more energy in that front end, get him to step a little bit freer, it's naturally going to load up that hind end more because he's got to balance himself to turn a little bit faster, and he'll have to keep that hind end a little bit more stable as the front end goes around. Now that doesn't mean just go out there and, spin 100 miles an hour. This is just a snapshot in time. So it's not something you can go and work on every day. Just right now what I see, I'd like to see that rib cage just a little bit straighter and hustle that shoulder a little bit more, and that will help you a lot in that turnaround. But I'd also like to see you pitch him away a little bit more in that spin as well. Make sure you're not holding him or pulling him into that spin. Turn him loose, let him fall apart, even if you know he will, and then correct it. But you got to make him responsible for himself and his own body as he steps around there. So I'd like to see you pitch him away a little bit more there in that spin. Right there again, you can see when his hip comes to the camera, you can see how much that kind of rib is hanging there to the outside. So I'd like to see that straightened up outside the spin. Walk forward and around, move that. I wouldn't really side pass him. I'd walk forward and around and move that rib cage off that outside leg.